She was 7 years old when her voice disappeared forever. He was a warrior who had lost his reason to fight. But when destiny placed a broken child in the path of a broken man, both would discover that some wounds can only heal when too damaged. Souls choose to trust again. The little girl hadn't made a sound in 3 months. Not since her uncle Jeremiah Baker had finished what he called her special lessons and locked her in the root cellar for the last time. She sat motionless on the wooden steps of the abandoned trading post, her small frame draped in a torn calico dress that had once been yellow but now bore the stains of fear and neglect. Her bare feet were cut and swollen from walking barefoot across the harsh Arizona territory, and her eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had seen too much evil for such a young soul to carry. Gray Eagle had been tracking the raiders for 6 days through the unforgiving desert, following their trail of destruction across the Apache homeland his people once called sacred.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The Chiricahua warrior moved like a ghost through the scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, his weathered face a mask of grim determination beneath the traditional red bandana that marked him as one of the last free Apache still living by the old ways. At 42 winters, Gray Eagle had buried more friends than most men could count, had watched his wife and infant son die of the white man's fever 5 years past, and had spent every day since then existing rather than living, hunting bounties and tracking criminals because it was the only thing that still gave his life any purpose. The trading post of Cedar Ridge sat like a scar against the desert landscape, its sun-bleached wood and broken windows telling the story of another frontier dream that had died hard under the relentless Arizona sun. Gray Eagle approached with the caution of a man who had learned that abandoned places often held the worst kinds of surprises, his hand resting on the worn grip of his Colt revolver while his dark eyes scanned every shadow for signs of danger. The raiders he'd been tracking had hit this place 2 weeks ago, according to the territorial marshal who'd hired him, but something about the scene felt wrong, felt like there were pieces of the story that hadn't been told. That's when he saw her. The child sat so still that at first Gray Eagle thought she might be a discarded doll, her blonde hair hanging in tangled curtains around a face that should have been bright with the joy of childhood, but instead looked ancient with suffering. She didn't flinch when his boots scraped against the wooden porch, didn't turn when he spoke her name softly in English, didn't even blink when a rattlesnake slithered past her feet close enough to strike. This wasn't the normal fear of a child who had witnessed violence. Gray Eagle realized with a chill that went deeper than the desert night. This was the hollow emptiness of a young soul that had been systematically destroyed from the inside out. Little one, Gray Eagle said in the gentlest voice his scarred throat could manage, crouching down to make himself less threatening while keeping his movements slow and deliberate. My name is Gray Eagle. I'm here to help you. The girl's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment, and in that brief glance, the Apache warrior saw something that made his weathered heart crack like drought-dried earth. It wasn't just fear in those blue eyes. It was the kind of broken recognition that comes when someone has learned the people who should protect them are the ones who hurt them most. Gray Eagle had seen that look before, in the eyes of Apache children who had survived the massacre at Camp Grant, in the faces of his own people when they spoke of the horrors inflicted by soldiers who claimed to be bringing civilization to the frontier. But this was different, more personal, the kind of damage that came not from the random cruelty of war, but from the deliberate, calculated evil of someone who had taken pleasure in breaking something small and innocent. The warrior's trained eyes took in every detail of the scene with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to read stories written in blood and violence. The girl's dress had been carefully mended in places, suggesting someone had once cared for her appearance, but the repairs were old, and the fabric was now torn in ways that spoke of recent rough handling. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, her knuckles bore the faded yellow remnants of old bruises, and there were rope burns around her thin wrists that had been healing for weeks. Most telling of all were the marks on her neck, finger-shaped. Bruises that were nearly healed, but still visible to someone who knew how to look for such things. Gray Eagle had seen similar marks on Apache women who had been captured by slavers, and the sight of them on a child this young made something murderous rise in his chest like a flash flood in a desert canyon. "Where is your family, little one?" Gray Eagle asked, though he suspected the answer would not be one that brought comfort to either of them. The girl's only response was to pull her knees tighter against her chest and rock slightly, a motion so small it was barely visible, but which spoke volumes about the kind of self-soothing behavior children developed when no one else was there to comfort them. Gray Eagle settled himself on the porch steps, far enough away to avoid seeming threatening, but close enough to intervene if danger appeared. He had learned patience during his years as a scout for the cavalry, before he'd grown disgusted with their methods and returned to living by Apache law, and he applied that patience now as he studied the child and tried to piece together her story from the clues scattered around the abandoned trading post. The building itself told part of the tale. This had been the Baker trading post, according to the faded sign hanging askew above the door. And Gray Eagle remembered hearing talk in the territorial saloons about old Jeremiah Baker, a man who'd made his fortune selling whiskey to Indians and guns to anyone with enough silver to pay his prices. Baker had been known as a hard man even by frontier standards, the kind who'd sell his own mother if the price was right, but he'd always managed to stay just barely on the legal side of territorial law. The Apache had heard darker rumors too. Whispered stories about Baker's treatment of the Apache women who sometimes traded at his post, and about the way certain children seemed to disappear from the settlements near his trading routes. Now, the trading post sat empty, its shelves stripped bare, and its windows broken. But there were signs that someone had been living here recently. A child's crude drawings were scratched into the wooden walls of what must have been a back room, and Gray Eagle's heart clenched as he recognized the images. Stick figures of a man with angry slashes for a mouth, a little girl with tears drawn as jagged lines down her face, and over, pictures of doors with heavy locks drawn in the kind of obsessive detail that spoke of a child's desperate wish to escape. The Apache warrior had seen enough battlefields to recognize the aftermath of violence, but this felt different, more intimate, and somehow more evil than the clean brutality of warfare. This was the kind of cruelty that happened behind closed doors, the kind that destroyed spirits as efficiently as bullets destroyed bodies. As Gray Eagle sat in the gathering dusk, watching the child who seemed to have forgotten how to be human, he found himself thinking of his own lost son and wondering, what kind of man could look at something so small and helpless and choose to bring it harm instead of protection? His boy would have been about this girl's age now, if the fever hadn't taken him, and Gray Eagle could picture his son's bright laughter and endless questions about the world around him. This child before him should have been asking about birds and flowers and why the sky was blue. Instead, she sat silent as stone, trapped inside whatever horrors her uncle had inflicted upon her innocent mind. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Gray Eagle's hand move instinctively toward his weapon, but he forced himself to remain calm and non-threatening as three riders emerged from the desert twilight. The lead rider was a man Gray Eagle recognized from wanted posters, a bounty hunter named Caleb Morrison, who had a reputation for bringing in his quarries dead more often than alive. The two men flanking Morrison looked like the kind of hired guns who asked no questions as long as the pay was steady, and all three of them wore the hard expressions of men who had come looking for something specific. Their horses were lathered with sweat and their clothes were dusty from hard riding, suggesting they had been traveling fast and with purpose. Well, Morrison called out as he reined in his horse, his voice carrying the false joviality of a snake oil salesman. "Gray Eagle, isn't it? Heard you were the best tracker in the territory."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The bounty hunter's eyes shifted to the child on the steps, and Gray Eagle saw something predatory flicker across the man's weathered features. That there's Daisy Lou Baker, and I've got a legal warrant for her return to her legal guardian. Morrison patted his shirt pocket, where the corner of an official-looking document was visible, but Gray Eagle noticed the man's hand shook slightly as he did so. Gray Eagle remained seated, his posture relaxed but his muscles coiled like a mountain cat preparing to spring. "The child appears to be in distress," he said carefully, his English carrying only the faintest trace of his Apache accent. "Perhaps it would be wise to determine her condition before moving her." The Apache's words were diplomatic, but his tone carried an undertone of steel that made Morrison's horse dance nervously beneath him. Gray Eagle had learned long ago that the key to survival on the frontier was knowing when to fight and when to talk, and right now he was gathering information while preparing for either possibility. Morrison's laugh was as ugly as his intentions. "Her condition ain't none of your concern, Apache. The girl's uncle hired us to bring her home after she ran off, and that's exactly what we're gonna do." One of Morrison's companions shifted in his saddle, hand moving toward his gun, but Gray Eagle didn't so much as twitch. He had faced down cavalry charges and outlaw gangs, and 3 hired thugs didn't particularly concern him. What concerned him was the way the child had gone even more rigid at the mention of her uncle's name, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid in a way that suggested she was fighting off a panic attack. "The uncle," Gray Eagle said quietly, his dark eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "Would that be Jeremiah Baker?" The Apache warrior had developed an almost supernatural ability to read men during his years of survival, and he could see the slight tension around Morrison's eyes that suggested the bounty hunter wasn't entirely comfortable with his current assignment. There was something about this job that didn't sit right with Morrison, despite his bluster, and Gray Eagle filed that information away for future use. "That's right," Morrison replied, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the arrangement. "Old Jeremiah's been worried sick about his little niece ever since she wandered off. Says she's been having spells since her parents died, gets confused and runs away." The bounty hunter's words sounded rehearsed, like he was reciting a story. He'd been told rather than relating facts he believed. Morrison was a hard man who'd done terrible things for money, but even he seemed to have limits, and Gray Eagle suspected those limits were being tested by whatever Jeremiah Baker had told him about his missing niece. Gray Eagle looked at the child, who had gone even more rigid at the mention of her uncle's name. The fear in her eyes had transformed into something approaching terror, and the Apache warrior found himself remembering his grandmother's stories about the Wendigos, the cannibalistic spirits that wore human faces while devouring everything good and innocent they could find. Some evils, his grandmother had taught him, were too pure to be fought with conventional weapons. They required a different kind of strength, the kind that came from protecting the innocent rather than seeking revenge for the guilty. "The child does not wish to go," Gray Eagle observed, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made Morrison's horse dance nervously. The Apache had learned to read the subtle signs of trauma during his years of war and loss, and everything about Daisy Lou Baker's posture and behavior screamed of systematic abuse. This wasn't a child who had simply run away from home. This was a victim who had escaped her tormentor and would rather die in the desert than return to his care. "Don't matter what she wishes," Morrison snapped, losing some of his false friendliness. "She's a minor, and her uncle's got legal custody. Now step aside, Apache, before this gets unpleasant." The bounty hunter's hand dropped to his gun, but he didn't draw. Something in Gray Eagle's stillness warned him that any sudden movement might be his last. Morrison had built his reputation on intimidating lesser men, but the Apache warrior sitting before him radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of surviving impossible odds. Gray Eagle finally stood, his movements fluid and controlled, and all three bounty hunters suddenly remembered why Apache warriors had been the most feared fighters on the frontier. The Apache wasn't particularly tall, but he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of surviving in a world that wanted him dead. And there was something in his dark eyes that suggested these three men might have bitten off considerably more than they could chew. His hand rested casually near his weapon, but his entire body had become a weapon, coiled and ready to strike with lethal precision. "I have seen the marks on the child," Gray Eagle said, his voice dropping to the kind of quiet that made smart. Men think twice about their next move. "I have seen the drawings on the walls, the rope burns on her wrists, the fear in her eyes when her uncle's name is spoken. This is not a child who has wandered away from loving care." The Apache's words carried the weight of absolute certainty, and even Morrison's hired guns shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They had signed on to collect a runaway child, not to participate in returning a victim to her abuser. Morrison's hand dropped to his gun, but he didn't draw. Something in the Apache's stillness warned him that any sudden movement might be his last. "You calling me a liar, Redskin?" The bounty hunter's voice carried a forced bravado, but Gray Eagle could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Morrison was beginning to suspect that he'd been lied to about the nature of this job, and that realization was making him reconsider his options. "I am calling you a man who takes money without asking the right questions," Gray Eagle replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the deadly tension in the air. "And I am telling you that this child will not be returning to the man who has broken her spirit." The Apache warrior had made his decision, and once Gray Eagle decided something, he saw it through to the end regardless of the consequences. He had lost too much in his life to stand by and watch evil triumph over innocence. The standoff stretched like a taut bowstring. Three armed men facing one Apache warrior, while a traumatized child sat frozen between them. The desert wind whistled through the broken windows of the trading post, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. But the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison's eyes darted between Gray Eagle and his two companions, clearly calculating his chances. The Apache was obviously skilled, but he was outnumbered 3-1, and Morrison had built his reputation on taking calculated risks. "Last chance, Apache," Morrison said, his hand tightening on his gun grip. "Step aside, or we'll move you aside." The bounty hunter's words carried finality, but Gray Eagle could see the doubt creeping into the man's eyes. Morrison was beginning to understand that this wasn't going to be the simple collection job he'd been promised, and that realization was making him question whether Jeremiah Baker's money was worth dying for. Gray Eagle's response came not in words but in action. His movement was so fast it seemed a blur, and suddenly Morrison found himself staring down the barrel of a Colt revolver, while his own weapon was still in its holster. The two hired guns started to draw, but Gray Eagle's voice stopped them cold. "Your friend will be dead before your guns clear leather," the Apache said conversationally. "And then you will join him. The choice is yours." The warrior's tone was as calm as if he were discussing the weather, but the absolute certainty in his voice left no doubt that he meant every word. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the desert and the nervous snorting of the horses. Then Morrison slowly raised his hands, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This ain't over, Apache," he said through gritted teeth. The bounty hunter's pride was wounded, but his survival instincts were stronger than his ego, and he recognized that Gray Eagle was not a man to be trifled with. "No," Gray Eagle agreed, his gun never wavering. "It is not, but it is over for today. Ride away and do not return. If I see you near this child again, I will forget that I am a civilized man and remember only that I am Apache." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone, but the three bounty hunters understood the message clearly. Gray Eagle was offering them one chance to walk away alive, and they would be fools not to take it. The three bounty hunters wheeled their horses and rode off into the gathering darkness. But Gray Eagle knew they would be back. Men like Morrison didn't give up easily, especially when their reputations were at stake, and the legal warrant Morrison claimed to carry would bring more trouble soon enough. But for now, the immediate danger had passed, and Gray Eagle could turn his attention to the broken child who sat watching him with something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope. "They are gone, little one," Gray Eagle said gently, holstering his weapon and crouching down again. "But they will return with more men. We cannot stay here." The child's eyes met his for a longer moment this time, and Gray Eagle saw the intelligence behind the trauma, the quick mind that had kept her alive despite everything that had been done to her. Daisy Lou Baker was more than just a victim, Gray Eagle realized. She was a survivor, and survivors could be taught to fight back. The question was whether an Apache warrior who had lost his own family could find the patience and wisdom to help a white child learn to trust again. Looking into those haunted blue eyes, Gray Eagle made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. He would not simply rescue this child and hand her over to the territorial authorities. He would teach her to survive, to fight back, and perhaps in doing so, he might remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. Gray Eagle's hidden camp lay 3 miles into the Dragoon Mountains, tucked away in a canyon that few white men had ever seen, and fewer still had lived to describe. The Apache had chosen this place for its natural defenses and its proximity to fresh water, but also because it reminded him of the sacred places his grandmother had shown him as a child, before the soldiers came and changed everything forever. Ancient petroglyphs covered the canyon walls, telling stories of his people's connection to this land, and sometimes in the early morning light, Gray Eagle could almost hear the voices of his ancestors whispering their approval of his choices. The journey to the camp tested both Gray Eagle's patience and Daisy Lou's fragile endurance. The child had not spoken a single word since he'd found her, but she followed him with the mechanical obedience of someone who had learned that resistance brought only pain. She stumbled frequently on the rocky terrain, her bare feet bleeding from cuts and scrapes, but she never cried out or asked to rest. This stoic acceptance of suffering worried Gray Eagle more than tears would have, because it spoke of a spirit that had been systematically broken down until it no longer expected kindness or comfort from the world. When they finally reached the camp as the desert stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Gray Eagle watched Daisy Lou's reaction carefully. Most white children would have been frightened by the primitive conditions, the animal hide shelter, the weapons hanging from wooden stakes, and the general atmosphere of a place designed for war rather than comfort. But Daisy Lou simply stood where Gray Eagle had placed her and waited for instructions, her small hands clasped behind, her back in a pose that suggested she had been trained to stand at attention for long periods of time. The Apache warrior had prepared this camp to serve as a temporary refuge while he decided what to do with the child. But looking at her now in the flickering light of this small fire, he realized that temporary might not be enough. This wasn't a matter of finding Daisy Lou a safe place to stay until the territorial authorities could sort out her legal situation. This was about healing damage so profound that it might take months or even years to undo. And Gray Eagle wasn't sure he was the right man for such a delicate task. "Sit," Gray Eagle said gently, gesturing to a flat rock near the fire that he had covered with a soft deer hide. Daisy Lou obeyed immediately, settling herself with the careful precision of someone who had learned that any movement might be interpreted as defiance. The Apache studied her face in the firelight, noting the way her eyes tracked his every movement while her body remained perfectly still. She was watching him the way a prey animal watches a predator, alert for any sign of danger but too exhausted to run. Gray Eagle began the slow process of tending to Daisy Lou's immediate needs, starting with her injured feet. He heated water, in a metal pot that had been a gift from a grateful cavalry officer years ago, adding herbs his grandmother had taught him to use for healing cuts and preventing infection. When he knelt beside Daisy Lou with the warm water and clean cloth, she flinched instinctively, but didn't pull away. The Apache worked in silence, cleaning each cut with gentle thoroughness while trying not to think about how small her feet were. How young she was to have endured so much. The child's reaction to his ministrations told Gray Eagle volumes about her recent experiences. She tensed whenever he touched her, not with the normal wariness of a child unused to strangers, but with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned to associate physical contact with pain. When he accidentally brushed against a particularly tender spot, she bit her lip so hard that blood appeared, clearly determined not to make any sound that might be interpreted as complaint or weakness. "You can cry if it hurts," Gray Eagle said softly, not looking up from his work. "Tears are not weakness. They are the body's way of washing away pain." But Daisy Lou remained silent, her small jaw set with determination that would have been admirable in different circumstances, but was heartbreaking in a 7-year-old child. Gray Eagle finished bandaging her feet and moved on to examining them. Rope burns on her wrists, his anger at Jeremiah Baker growing with each new injury he discovered. The Apache's experience with traumatized children was limited, but not non-existent. During his years as a cavalry scout, he had encountered Apache children who had been captured by soldiers and later returned to their families, and he had seen how the experience of captivity and abuse could hollow out a young spirit until nothing remained but a shell that went through the motions of living without actually being alive. The key to helping such children, his grandmother had always said, was patience and consistency, creating a routine that felt safe enough for trust to slowly begin growing again. Gray Eagle began by establishing simple patterns that Daisy Lou could predict and rely upon. He showed her where she would sleep, a small alcove in the rock wall that he had lined with soft furs and positioned so that she could see the entrance to the canyon but still feel protected on 3 sides. He demonstrated how to use the various tools and supplies in the camp, explaining each item's purpose in simple terms, even though she never responded. Most importantly, he began teaching her the basic skills she would need to survive in the wilderness, not because he expected her to remain in his camp forever, but because knowledge was power, and power was what this child needed most. The first breakthrough came on the 3rd day, when Gray Eagle was teaching Daisy Lou how to identify edible plants and roots. The Apache had been explaining the difference between 2 similar-looking berries, one nutritious and one poisonous, when he noticed that the child was actually listening rather than simply enduring his instruction. Her eyes were focused on the plants in his hands, and when he held up the poisonous berry and shook his head, she nodded slightly to show that she understood. "Good," Gray Eagle said, handing her the safe berry to examine. "Knowledge keeps you alive when nothing else will. My grandmother taught me that wisdom is the only thing that cannot be taken from you, even by your enemies." For just a moment, something flickered in Daisy Lou's eyes that might have been interest, and Gray Eagle felt a tiny spark of hope that perhaps this broken child could be taught to heal. Over the following days, Gray Eagle established a routine that became the foundation of Daisy Lou's recovery. They woke at dawn when the desert air was still cool and the light was soft and golden. Gray Eagle would prepare a simple breakfast of corn cakes and dried meat while Daisy Lou watched from her sleeping place, and then he would invite her to join him by the fire. She always came, moving with that same mechanical obedience, but Gray Eagle noticed that she was beginning to sit a little closer to the flames. As if drawn by their warmth and light, after breakfast, they would walk the canyon with Gray Eagle, pointing out various plants, rocks, and animal signs, while explaining their significance in Apache culture and survival lore. Daisy Lou never spoke during these walks, but Gray Eagle could see that she was absorbing everything he taught her. When he showed her how to move silently through the brush, she practiced the technique with focused intensity. when he demonstrated how to read animal tracks in the sand. She studied each print with the concentration of a scholar examining ancient texts. The afternoons were spent on practical skills that Gray Eagle hoped would help rebuild Daisy Lou's confidence in her own abilities. He taught her how to start a fire using flint and steel, how to sharpen a knife on a whetstone, how to weave baskets from desert grasses, and how to prepare simple meals from the ingredients they gathered during their morning walks. These tasks required patience and practice, and Gray Eagle was pleased to see that Daisy Lou approached each challenge with determination rather than the hopeless resignation she had shown when he first found her. Evenings were reserved for what Gray Eagle thought of as soul healing, the kind of medicine that couldn't be found in herbs or techniques, but had to be cultivated through story and connection. As the fire burned low and the desert settled into its nightly quiet, Gray Eagle would tell Daisy Lou stories from Apache tradition. Tales of Coyote the Trickster, of brave warriors who faced impossible odds, of children who discovered hidden strengths they never knew they possessed. He didn't expect her to respond to these stories, but he hoped they might plant seeds of possibility in her wounded spirit. One evening, as Gray Eagle was telling the story of a young Apache girl who outsmarted a band of enemy warriors by pretending to be weak while secretly preparing to fight back, he noticed that Daisy Lou's hands were moving. She was using her fingers to trace patterns in the sand beside her sleeping place, and when Gray Eagle looked more closely, he realized she was drawing scenes from the story he was telling. The stick figures were crude but expressive, showing the clever girl from the tale using her wits to defeat much larger opponents. "You understand stories," Gray Eagle observed quietly, not wanting to startle Daisy Lou into stopping her drawing. "Stories are powerful medicine. They teach us that we are not alone in our struggles, that others have faced darkness and found ways to bring light back into their lives." The child's hand paused for just a moment, and Gray Eagle thought he saw her nod slightly before she returned to her artwork. The breakthrough Gray Eagle had been hoping for came during their second week together, triggered by an incident that could have ended in disaster. They were practicing tracking skills near a stream that ran through the bottom of the canyon when they were surprised by a mountain lion that had come to drink. The big cat was as startled as they were, but mountain lions were unpredictable, and this one showed signs of being injured and therefore potentially more aggressive than usual. Gray Eagle's first instinct was to put himself between Daisy Lou and the mountain lion, but as he started to move, the child surprised him by grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a large boulder that would provide better cover. Her movement was quick and decisive, showing that she had been paying attention to his lessons about using terrain for protection. Together, they crouched behind the boulder and waited while the mountain lion decided whether they represented a threat worth investigating. The lion eventually moved on, but the incident had revealed something important about Daisy Lou's mental state. When faced with external danger, she was capable of quick thinking and decisive action. The paralysis and mechanical obedience she displayed most of the time weren't signs of mental deficiency or permanent damage. They were protective responses she had developed to survive her uncle's abuse, and under the right circumstances, her natural intelligence and survival instincts could still function normally. "You did well," Gray Eagle told her as they watched the mountain lion disappear into the brush. "You remembered what I taught you about using cover, and you acted quickly to keep us both safe. That shows courage and wisdom." For the first time since he had found her, Daisy Lou looked directly at Gray Eagle and held his gaze for several seconds. There was still pain in her blue eyes, but there was also something else, something that might have been the faintest glimmer of pride. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Gray Eagle decided to try a different approach to reaching the wounded child. Instead of telling her a traditional Apache story, he began to speak about his own experiences, about the losses he had suffered and the way grief had nearly destroyed his will to live. He told her about his wife, Singing Bird, and how her laughter had filled their lodge with joy. He spoke of his son, Little Wolf, and how the boy had loved to chase butterflies and ask endless questions about everything he saw. When the fever took them, Gray Eagle said, his voice growing quiet with remembered pain, I thought my life was over. I stopped caring about anything except revenge against the soldiers who had brought the sickness to our village. For many seasons, I lived only to hurt the people who had hurt me. But revenge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. It only made my own pain worse. He looked at Daisy Lou, who was listening with an intensity that suggested his words were reaching something deep inside her damaged spirit. The morning I found you, Gray Eagle continued, I was tracking raiders not because I cared about justice, but because killing bad men was the only thing that made me feel alive anymore. But when I saw you sitting on those steps, so small and broken, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. She said that the spirits sometimes send us exactly what we need to heal, even when we don't know we need healing. The Apache warrior paused, studying Daisy Lou's face in the firelight. To Gray Eagle's amazement, Daisy Lou's lips parted slightly, and for a moment it seemed like she might speak. But then she closed her mouth again and looked away, as if the effort of trying to communicate was too frightening or painful to sustain. Still, the fact that she had almost spoken was progress, and Gray Eagle filed it away as another small victory in their ongoing battle against the darkness that Jeremiah Baker had planted in her young soul. The real breakthrough came during their third week together, triggered by an event so small that Gray Eagle almost missed its significance. They were practicing what he called silent walking, a technique his people used to move through enemy territory without being detected. When Daisy Lou stepped on a thorn that penetrated right through the sole of her moccasin, the pain was sharp and unexpected, and for the first time since Gray Eagle had found her, Daisy Lou made a sound. It wasn't a word, just a small gasp of surprise and pain, but it was the first vocalization he had heard from her. Gray Eagle immediately knelt to examine her foot, carefully removing the thorn and checking to make sure no piece of it had broken off in the wound. As he worked, he kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation, telling Daisy Lou that such injuries were common and nothing to be ashamed of, that even the most experienced Apache warriors sometimes stepped on thorns when they were learning to move silently through unfamiliar terrain. Pain is a teacher, Gray Eagle said as he cleaned the small wound with water and herbs. It tells us when something needs our attention, when we need to be more careful or take better care of ourselves. The trick is learning to listen to pain without letting it control us. He looked up at Daisy Lou, who was watching his ministrations. With unusual focus, my uncle said pain was punishment. Daisy Lou whispered, her voice so soft that Gray Eagle almost thought he had imagined it. But no, she had spoken, her first words in months, and they revealed more about her torment than hours of questioning might have accomplished. Gray Eagle felt his heart clench with rage at Jeremiah Baker, but he kept his expression calm and his voice gentle. Your uncle was wrong, Gray Eagle said firmly, continuing to tend to her foot while giving her time to process his words. Pain is not punishment. Sometimes it is a warning. Sometimes it is the price of growth. Sometimes it is simply bad luck. But it is never punishment for being who you are. He finished bandaging her foot and sat back on his heels, meeting her eyes directly. You are not bad, little one. Whatever your uncle told you, whatever he made you believe about yourself, it was lies. You are good and strong and worthy of protection and care. The pain he caused you was his choice, his evil, not something you deserved or brought upon yourself. Gray Eagle's words carried all the conviction he could muster, and he watched as Daisy Lou's eyes filled with tears for the first time since he had found her. The tears came slowly at first, just a few drops that she tried to wipe away before. Gray Eagle could see them. But then the dam burst, and years of suppressed grief and terror came pouring out in great, racking sobs that shook her small frame like earthquake tremors. Gray Eagle wanted desperately to comfort her, to hold her, and tell her that everything would be all right, but he knew that physical contact might still feel threatening to her. Instead, he sat nearby and spoke in low, soothing tones, telling her that tears were good, that crying was how the heart cleaned itself of poison. When the storm of tears finally passed, Daisy Lou looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden that she had finally been allowed to set down. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at Gray Eagle with an expression that was still sad, but no longer completely hopeless. "Will you tell me more stories?" she asked, her voice still barely above a whisper, but clearly audible. In the desert quiet. Stories about children who got strong enough to fight back. Gray Eagle felt something tight in his chest loosen at her words, because they suggested that Daisy Lou was beginning to imagine a future for herself, a future where she might be more than just a victim. "Yes," Gray Eagle promised, settling himself more comfortably by the fire. "I will tell you many such stories. But first, let me tell you about the little girl who was braver than she knew, who survived terrible things and still had enough heart left to ask for stories about hope." As the weeks turned into months in the hidden canyon, Daisy Lou began to transform from the hollow-eyed child Gray Eagle had found at the trading post into something resembling a normal 7-year-old girl, though one who had been tempered by experiences no child should ever endure. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather like watching a desert flower bloom after a rare rainfall, slow and tentative but undeniably real. Gray Eagle found himself looking forward to each small sign of progress, each moment when Daisy Lou's natural curiosity overcame her learned caution. The Apache warrior had never considered himself a teacher of children, but necessity had made him one, and he discovered that he possessed a patience he hadn't known existed within his scarred heart. Every morning brought new lessons, not just in survival skills but in the harder task of learning to trust the world again. Gray Eagle taught Daisy Lou to read the desert's moods, to understand the language of wind and weather, to recognize the difference between the footprints of friend and foe. More importantly, he taught her that knowledge was power, and power was something that could never be taken away by those who sought to harm her. One morning in early autumn, when the desert air carried the first hint of winter's approach, Gray Eagle woke to find Daisy Lou already up and tending the fire with practiced efficiency. She had learned to bank the coals properly the night before and rekindle them at dawn, a skill that spoke of both intelligence and responsibility. But what caught Gray Eagle's attention wasn't her competence with the fire, it was the fact that she was humming softly to herself as she worked, a wordless melody that seemed to come from some deep place in her healing spirit. "Good morning, little one," Gray Eagle said gently, not wanting to startle her out of her musical reverie. Daisy Lou looked up and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. It was the first time Gray Eagle had seen her look genuinely happy, and the sight hit him with unexpected force. This was what she was supposed to look like, he realized, this bright-eyed child with music in her heart, not the broken doll he had found sitting in the ruins of her uncle's cruelty. "I dreamed about my mama last night," Daisy Lou said, her voice still soft but growing stronger with each passing day. "She used to sing to me when I was scared. I couldn't remember the words, but I remembered the tune." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up into the morning air. "She had yellow hair like mine, and she smelled like wildflowers. Uncle Jeremiah said she was weak, but I don't think that's true. I think maybe being gentle isn't the same as being weak." Gray Eagle felt his throat tighten with emotion at her words. "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman," he said carefully. "And you are right about the difference between gentleness and weakness. The strongest warriors I have known were also the most gentle with those who needed protection. Strength without gentleness is just cruelty, and gentleness without strength cannot protect what matters most." He settled beside the fire, accepting the cup of coffee Daisy Lou had prepared for him with the same serious attention she brought to all her tasks. The conversation about her mother seemed to unlock something in Daisy Lou, and over the following days she began to share more memories of her life before her uncle's guardianship. She told Grey Eagle about her father, a traveling preacher who had been killed in a stagecoach robbery, and her mother, who had died of pneumonia the following winter, leaving 7-year-old Daisy Lou with no family except Jeremiah Baker. The picture that emerged was of a child who had known love and safety for the first few years of her life, which explained both her capacity for healing and the depth of her trauma when that safety was destroyed. "I used to help Mama in her garden," Daisy Lou said one afternoon as they gathered wild herbs in a meadow near the canyon. "She taught me which plants were good for healing and which ones would make you sick. She said God put everything we needed right in the ground, if we just knew how to look for it." The child's hands moved with surprising confidence among them. Plants, selecting the ones Grey Eagle had taught her to recognize, while avoiding those that might be harmful. Grey Eagle watched her work and marveled at how quickly she was recovering not just her voice, but her natural intelligence and curiosity. "Your mother was wise," he said. "My grandmother taught me similar things, though she said it was the spirits of the earth who provided for us, rather than your Christian God. Perhaps they are not so different, these spirits and your God. Perhaps they both want the same thing: for people to know how to take care of themselves and each other." This led to long conversations about the differences and similarities between Apache and Christian beliefs, discussions that helped Daisy Lou begin to make sense of her place in a world that suddenly seemed much larger and more complex than the narrow prison her uncle had created for her. Grey Eagle was careful never to criticize her family's Christian faith, understanding that those beliefs connected her to her parents' memory, but he also shared his own spiritual traditions, giving her a broader perspective on the possibilities life might hold. The most significant breakthrough came when Grey Eagle began teaching Daisy Lou to defend herself. He had been reluctant to introduce weapons training, fearing it might re-traumatize her, but as her confidence grew, he realized that learning to fight back might be exactly what she needed to complete her healing. He started with simple techniques, showing her how to use her small size and quickness to her advantage, how to strike at vulnerable points on a larger opponent, how to break free from various types of grabs and holds. "Fighting is not about anger," Grey Eagle explained as he demonstrated a basic escape technique. "Anger makes you stupid, makes you easy to predict and defeat. Fighting is about survival, about protecting yourself and those you care about. It requires a clear mind and a calm heart, even in the face of danger." He showed Daisy Lou how to twist free from a wrist grab, how to use her elbow as a weapon, how to create distance between herself and an attacker. To Grey Eagle's amazement, Daisy Lou took to the combat training with fierce enthusiasm. Her small hands learned to form proper fists. Her feet found the balance points Grey Eagle showed her, and her mind absorbed the tactical lessons with the hunger of someone who had been helpless for too long. Most importantly, he could see her confidence growing with each technique she mastered, her posture straightening and her eyes brightening as she realized she was no longer powerless. "I want to learn to use a knife," Daisy Lou announced one evening as they practiced her escape techniques. "Not to hurt people, but so they know they can't hurt me without a fight." Her voice carried a determination that would have been frightening in an adult, but was somehow reassuring in a child who had learned the hard way that the world could be a dangerous place. Grey Eagle considered her request carefully. Teaching a 7-year-old to use weapons was not something to be done lightly, but this was not a normal 7-year-old, and these were not normal circumstances. "A knife is a serious responsibility," he said finally. "It must never be drawn in anger, only in true need. And once you draw it, you must be prepared to use it, because showing a weapon you are not willing to use only gives your enemy an advantage." He studied her face in the firelight, seeing the mature understanding in her young eyes. The knife training began the next morning, starting with wooden practice blades and basic safety rules. Grey Eagle taught Daisy Lou how to hold a knife properly, how to maintain her balance while using it, how to target vital areas that would incapacitate rather than merely wound. More importantly, he taught her the mental discipline required to use a weapon effectively, the ability to act decisively when threatened while maintaining enough control to stop when the threat was eliminated. The knife is not just a weapon, Gray Eagle explained as they practiced basic strikes and parries. It is a tool for many things, for preparing food, for making other tools, for surviving in the wilderness. But when it becomes a weapon, it carries great responsibility. You must never draw it unless you are prepared to kill, and you must never kill unless there is no other choice. Do you understand this? Daisy Lou nodded solemnly, her small hands gripping the practice blade with respectful attention. As autumn deepened into winter, Gray Eagle began to realize that their time in the canyon was changing him as much as it was healing. Daisy Lou, the daily routine of caring for another person, of teaching and protecting and watching over someone who depended on him, had awakened something in his heart that he thought had died with his wife and son. He found himself thinking less about revenge and more about the future, less about the past's pain and more about the possibility of joy returning to his life. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a meal of rabbit stew and corn cakes, Daisy Lou asked a question that caught Gray Eagle completely off guard. "Are you going to keep me forever?" she said, her voice small but steady. "Or will you find me a new family when I'm all better?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from their fire, carrying with it implications that Gray Eagle had been trying not to think about. The Apache warrior looked at this child who had become so important to him. This brave little girl who had survived horrors that would have broken many adults. And he realized that somewhere along the way she had stopped being a responsibility and become something much more precious. "What would you like?" he asked carefully. "If you could choose your future, what would it look like?" He waited for her answer, knowing that it would shape the rest of both their lives. Daisy Lou was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if she might find her answer written in their dancing light. "I want to stay with you," she said finally. "You're the first person who ever made me feel safe. But I don't want to be just someone you take care of. I want to be someone who helps take care of you too, like a real family." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight of longing that made Gray Eagle's chest tight with emotion. "You already help take care of me," Gray Eagle said quietly. "You tend the fire in the mornings, you help gather food and medicine. You watch for danger when we travel. But more than that, you have given me a reason to want to see tomorrow, and the day after that. For 5 years, I have been living in the past, mourning what I lost. You have taught me to live in the present. Again, to hope for the future again." He reached across the fire and gently touched her hand. "If you want to stay with me, little warrior, then you shall stay. We will make our own family, you and I, bound not by blood, but by choice and by love. I will teach you everything I know about surviving in this world, and you will teach me things I have forgotten about joy and hope, and what it means to have something worth protecting." Gray Eagle's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Daisy Lou's face lit up with a happiness so pure and radiant that it seemed to illuminate the entire canyon. "Really? You mean it? We can be a real family?" She bounced on her toes with excitement, and for a moment she looked like any normal child receiving wonderful news, all traces of her traumatic past temporarily forgotten in the joy of the present moment. "Really?" Gray Eagle confirmed, and found himself smiling in a way he hadn't since his wife and son had died. "But being family means responsibilities as well as privileges. You will continue your training, you will learn to be strong and capable and wise. And someday, when you are grown, you may choose to help other children who have suffered as you have suffered. The healing you have found here in this canyon, it is not meant to be kept to yourself. It is meant to be shared, as if summoned." By their conversation about the future, The past chose that moment to intrude upon their happiness. The sound of horses approaching the canyon entrance reached Gray Eagle's trained ears, and he immediately shifted from father figure to Apache. Warrior, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon while his body positioned itself between Daisy Lou and the potential threat. The riders were still distant, but they were coming with purpose, and Gray Eagle had learned long ago that visitors to hidden places rarely brought good news. Stay low and move to the back of the canyon, Gray Eagle instructed Daisy Lou, his voice calm but carrying the authority of command. Take your knife and the emergency supplies I showed you. If something happens to me, you know the way to the Apache village near the Mexican border. Tell them you are under the protection of Gray Eagle, and they will help you. He checked his weapons one final time, the peaceful mood of moments before replaced by the cold focus of a man preparing for battle. But Daisy Lou surprised him by shaking her head firmly. No, she said, her small chin set with determination. You said we were family now. Family doesn't run away and leave each other behind. Family fights together. She drew her knife, the blade gleaming in the firelight, and took a defensive stance beside Gray Eagle, her feet positioned exactly as he had taught her. Gray Eagle felt a surge of pride mixed with terror at her words. This was what he had hoped to achieve through months of training and healing, to restore her courage and her will to fight. But now, faced with real danger, he found himself wishing she was still the compliant victim, who would obey his command to flee rather than this fierce young warrior who was determined to stand beside him whatever the cost. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, and Gray Eagle counted at least 6 riders, probably more. Too many for him to handle alone, especially while protecting Daisy Lou, but perhaps not too many for a man and a child who had learned to fight as a team. Very well, he said quietly, pride and fear warring in his heart. We fight together. But you stay behind me, and if I fall, you run. That is not a request, little warrior. That is an order from your family. The riders who emerged from the desert darkness were not the bounty hunters Gray Eagle had expected, but something far worse. Jeremiah Baker himself led the group, his bulky frame hunched forward in the saddle like a vulture preparing to feast on carrion. Behind him rode 8 heavily armed men, their faces bearing the hard look of professional killers who had been promised good money for a dirty job. But it was the 9th rider who made Gray Eagle's blood run cold with recognition and rage. Captain Wesley Morrison of the Territorial Cavalry sat his horse with military precision, his blue uniform crisp despite the long ride through the desert. Gray Eagle had served under Morrison years ago, before the Apache warrior had grown disgusted with the Army's methods and returned to his people's ways. Morrison was a man who prided himself on following orders without question, regardless of their moral implications, and his presence here meant that Jeremiah Baker had somehow convinced the territorial government that his cause was just Gray Eagle, Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I have a legal warrant for the return of Miss Daisy Lou Baker to her lawful guardian. Surrender the child immediately, and you will be allowed to leave unharmed. The captain's words were formal and official, but Gray Eagle could see the discomfort in the man's eyes. Morrison might follow orders, but he wasn't entirely comfortable with this particular mission. Gray Eagle stepped forward, keeping Daisy Lou behind him while positioning himself to use the canyon's natural defenses to best advantage. The child stays with me, Morrison. Whatever lies Baker has told you, whatever documents he has shown you, they do not change the truth of what he has done to her. The Apache's voice carried across the canyon with quiet authority, and several of the hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles. They had been told this would be a simple recovery operation, not a confrontation with one of the most dangerous warriors in the territory. Jeremiah Baker urged his horse forward, his face twisted with the kind of righteous indignation that evil men often wore when their crimes were exposed. That little girl is my bloodkin, and she belongs with family, not running wild with some savage who's probably filled her head with all kinds of lies." Baker's voice was loud and blustering, but Gray Eagle could see the nervous sweat on the man's forehead. The traitor was afraid, and afraid men were often the most dangerous. "Let her speak for herself," Gray Eagle said calmly. "If she chooses to go with you, I will not stop her. But if she chooses to stay, you will respect that choice and leave this place." The Apache warrior knew he was taking a tremendous risk by offering this compromise, but he also knew that Daisy Lou needed to face her abuser from a position of strength, rather than being protected like a helpless victim. Captain Morrison considered this proposal, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "The law doesn't recognize a child's right to refuse her legal guardian," he said finally. "But I suppose there's no harm in hearing what she has to say. Step forward, Miss Baker, and tell us whether you came here willingly or were taken against." "Your will." Morrison's tone was formal, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he genuinely wanted to hear Daisy Lou's side of the story for a moment. Gray Eagle feared that the old terror would return and Daisy Lou would retreat into the silent shell she had been when he first found her. But the child surprised everyone by stepping out from behind her protector, her small hand gripping her knife with steady confidence. The months of training and healing had transformed her from a victim into a survivor, and she faced her uncle with courage that would have been remarkable in an adult warrior. "I ran away because Uncle Jeremiah hurt me," Daisy Lou said, her young voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "He locked me in the root cellar when I tried to tell people what he was doing. He said if I ever told anyone, he would kill me and say I died in an accident." Her words were simple and direct, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. And even Baker's hired guns looked uncomfortable. Baker's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "She's been brainwashed by that Apache savage. She's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying. I've raised her since her parents died, given her a good Christian home, and this is how she repays me." The traitor's voice rose to a near shout, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Show them your wrists," Gray Eagle said quietly to Daisy Lou. "Show them the scars he left on you." The child rolled up her sleeves without hesitation, revealing the rope burns that had healed into permanent marks on her small wrists. The sight of those scars on a 7-year-old child caused several of Morrison's soldiers to exchange uncomfortable glances. Captain Morrison studied the scars with the eye of a man who had seen many kinds of violence in his military career. "Those are rope burns," he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "How did a child come to have rope burns on her wrists, Mr. Baker?" The captain's question carried the weight of official authority, and Baker seemed to shrink in, his saddle under the scrutiny. "She was always trying to run away," Baker stammered. "Sometimes I had to restrain her for her own safety. Children don't always understand what's best for them." His explanation sounded weak even to his own supporters, and Gray Eagle could see doubt creeping into the faces of some of the soldiers. But it was what happened next that changed everything. One of Baker's hired guns, a grizzled man with the look of someone who had seen too much violence, suddenly spoke up from the back of the group. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice rough with disgust. "I signed on to help recover a kidnapped child, not to drag a little girl back to someone who's been abusing her." The gunman wheeled his horse around and rode away into the darkness, and 2 of his companions followed suit. This defection seemed to break something in Jeremiah Baker's composure. "You're all fools," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "She's mine by law. I can do whatever I want with her." The mask of respectability finally slipped completely, revealing the monster that had been lurking beneath, and even Captain Morrison recoiled from the naked evil in the man's eyes. "Nobody owns another person," Daisy Lou said, her voice steady, despite the fear Gray Eagle could see in her eyes. "Gray Eagle taught me that. He said I belong to myself and I get to choose who I want to be with." I choose to stay with him because he protects me instead of hurting me." The child's words carried a dignity that would have been impressive in an adult, and they seemed to echo in the canyon like a pronouncement of judgment. The confrontation might have ended there, with Baker exposed as the monster he was and forced to retreat in shame. But evil men rarely accept defeat gracefully. With a roar of rage, Baker drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Daisy Lou. "If I can't have her, then nobody can," he shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. Gray Eagle moved faster than thought, throwing himself between the gun and the child while drawing his own weapon in the same fluid motion. Baker's shot rang out across the canyon, but it went wide as Gray Eagle's bullet took the traitor in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle to crash onto the rocky ground. The Apache warrior's second shot might have finished Baker permanently, but Captain Morrison's voice stopped him. "Enough," Morrison commanded, his own pistol drawn and pointed at Gray Eagle. "Lower your weapon, warrior. The threat is ended." The captain's voice carried authority, but also a note of respect for the Apache's protective instincts. Morrison was a military man, and he understood the code that demanded a warrior protect those under his care. Gray Eagle slowly lowered his weapon, but his eyes never left Jeremiah Baker, who was writhing on the ground and clutching his wounded shoulder. "The child has spoken her truth," the Apache said quietly. "Will you honor it, or will you force her to return to the man who just tried to murder her in front of witnesses?" The question hung in the air like smoke from gunpowder. Captain Morrison looked at Baker, then at Daisy Lou, then at the remaining soldiers who were clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Mr. Baker," he said formally, "you are under arrest for attempted murder and child endangerment. Sergeant Williams, see to his wound and prepare him for transport back to Tucson for trial." The captain holstered his weapon and turned to Gray Eagle. "As for you, warrior, the territorial government owes you a debt of gratitude for protecting this child from harm. Miss Baker will remain in your custody until the courts can make proper arrangements for her care." Morrison's words were official, but his tone was respectful. The captain had seen enough to understand that Gray Eagle was the child's protector, not her captor. As the soldiers prepared to leave with their prisoner, Jeremiah Baker made one last attempt to hurt the child he could no longer control. "You think you've won?" he snarled at Daisy Lou from his position on the ground. "You'll never be safe from me. I have friends, people who owe me favors. They'll come for you when you least expect it." His words were meant to plant seeds of fear that would grow into a lifetime of terror, but Daisy Lou surprised everyone, including herself, with her response. She walked over to where Baker lay bleeding and looked down at him with something that wasn't hatred or fear, but something far more powerful. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said quietly. "You made me small and scared, because that's the only way you could feel big and strong. But I'm not small anymore, and you're not strong. You're just a mean old man who hurts children, because he's too weak to fight someone who can fight back." Gray Eagle felt a surge of pride so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. This was the moment he had been working toward for months, the moment when Daisy Lou would face her abuser, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had reclaimed her power. The child who had been unable to speak when he found her was now standing over her tormentor and speaking truth with the authority of someone who had overcome the worst that life could throw at her. Baker's face twisted with impotent rage, but before he could respond, Captain Morrison gestured for his men to lift the wounded traitor and load him onto his horse. "That's enough," the captain said firmly. "Mr. Baker, you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise it." The soldiers moved with efficient professionalism, clearly eager to be done with this distasteful business. As the military detachment prepared to leave, Morrison approached Gray Eagle one final time. "The court will want to interview the child about her experiences," he said quietly. "Will she be able to testify if needed?" The question was practical. But Gray Eagle could hear the underlying concern for Daisy Lou's well-being. "She will testify." Gray Eagle replied without hesitation. "She has found her voice, and her voice will speak the truth. But she will testify as a survivor, not as a victim. There is a difference." The Apache warrior looked at Daisy Lou, who was standing tall and proud despite everything she had endured. Morrison nodded his understanding. "I'll make sure the prosecutor knows to treat her with appropriate respect." "And warrior?" The captain paused, seeming to struggle with something. "What you've done here, helping that child heal from what was done to her, it's the kind of thing that gives a man faith in human decency. The territory needs more men like you." Coming from a career military officer, the compliment carried significant weight. After the soldiers disappeared into the desert night with their prisoner, Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou stood together in the sudden quiet of their canyon sanctuary. The immediate danger had passed, but both of them understood that this confrontation had marked the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another. Daisy Lou was no longer a victim in hiding. She was a survivor who had faced her abuser and emerged victorious. "Are you all right, little warrior?" Gray Eagle asked, kneeling beside Daisy Lou and checking her for injuries. The child was shaking slightly, but her eyes were bright with something that looked like triumph rather than fear. "I'm scared," Daisy Lou admitted, "but not the same kind of scared as before. Before, I was scared of being weak and helpless. Now I'm scared of what comes next, but it's the good kind of scared. Like when you're about to do something brave and important." She looked up at Gray Eagle with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "What comes next," Gray Eagle said gently, "is whatever we choose to make come next. You have proven that you are strong enough to face anything, even the worst of your past. Now you must decide what kind of future you want to build with that strength." The Apache warrior felt a deep sense of satisfaction at how far they had both come from that night, when he found a broken child sitting in the ruins of a trading post. Daisy Lou was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. "I want to help other children," she said finally. "Children like I used to be, who think they're trapped and can never get away. I want to show them that they can be strong too, that they don't have to stay victims forever." Her words carried the conviction of someone who had discovered her life's purpose. Gray Eagle smiled, recognizing in her words the same desire for justice that had once driven him to seek revenge against those who had wronged his people. But where his quest for vengeance had nearly destroyed him, Daisy Lou's desire to help others would heal not only herself but everyone she touched. "Then that is what we will do," he promised. "Together, we will help others find the strength they need to survive and thrive. We will be healers instead of warriors, though we will always be ready to fight when fighting is necessary." As they settled by their fire to process the events of the evening, both Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The child who had been too terrified to speak was now ready to use her voice to help others find theirs. The warrior who had lost his family to death had gained a new family through choice and love. Together, they would face whatever challenges the future might bring, not as hunter and prey fleeing from the past, but as healers walking confidently toward whatever destiny awaited them. 6 months after Jeremiah Baker's trial and conviction, Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou had transformed their hidden canyon sanctuary into something unprecedented in the Arizona territory, a place where broken children could come to heal and learn that survival was possible even after the worst kinds of betrayal. Word of their work had spread quietly through the network of churches, trading posts, and territorial offices, carried by people who understood that some kinds of healing couldn't be found in conventional orphanages or foster homes. The first child to find their way to the canyon was a 9-year-old Mexican boy named Miguel Santos, whose parents had been murdered by bandits and who had spent 2 years living on the streets of Tucson before a kind priest heard his story and remembered hearing about an Apache warrior who had helped a little white girl recover from similar trauma. Miguel arrived thin and suspicious, speaking no English and trusting no one. But within weeks, Grey Eagle had him learning basic survival skills while Daisy Lou worked patiently to teach him that not all adults were enemies. "He reminds me of how I used to be," Daisy Lou observed one evening as they watched Miguel practice the knife techniques Grey Eagle had been teaching him. All sharp edges and ready to fight, but really just scared that someone's going to hurt him again. The child who had once been unable to speak had become remarkably perceptive about reading the emotional states of other traumatized children. Grey Eagle nodded, noting how Miguel positioned himself so he could always see all the exits from their camp, how he slept with one eye open and never let anyone approach him from behind. "Fear makes us careful," the Apache warrior said. "But too much fear makes us prisoners." Miguel is learning that he can be both safe and free, but it will take time. The patient wisdom Grey Eagle had developed during Daisy Lou's healing was now being applied to other children who needed the same kind of careful, consistent care. The second arrival was even more challenging. Rebecca Martinez was only 6 years old when her stepfather began visiting her room at night, and by the time a neighbor reported the abuse, the child had retreated so far into herself that she barely seemed aware of the outside world. She came to the canyon through a network of Mexican women who had heard whispered stories about the place where damaged children could learn to live again. Rebecca wouldn't speak to adults at all, but something about Daisy Lou's gentle persistence and obvious understanding of trauma began to crack the shell the younger child had built around herself. "She knows I've been where she is," Daisy Lou explained to Grey Eagle after spending an entire afternoon sitting silently beside Rebecca, while the younger girl drew pictures in the sand. "She can tell I understand what it's like when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you instead." Grey Eagle watched Daisy Lou work with Rebecca and marveled at the natural healing gifts the child had developed. Where he used practical skills and Apache wisdom to rebuild confidence and self-reliance. Daisy Lou offered something equally valuable, the living proof that recovery was possible. Her very presence told the other children that they could survive their trauma and emerge stronger on the other side. The third child changed everything. Thomas Whitehorse was a 12-year-old Apache boy whose own people had rejected him after he'd been captured by cavalry soldiers and held in a military prison for 6 months. When he finally escaped and returned to his village, he found that his family considered him contaminated by white culture, no longer truly Apache but clearly not white either. He existed in a liminal space that belonged to neither world, and his anger at this rejection had turned him into something dangerous. Thomas spoke fluent Apache, which allowed Grey Eagle to communicate with him in ways that weren't possible with the other children, but the boy's rage ran so deep that ordinary conversation seemed insufficient to reach him. He had been betrayed not just by individuals but by entire cultures, and his trust in humanity itself had been shattered in ways that would require extraordinary measures to repair. "He's angry at you for helping white children," Daisy Lou observed after watching Thomas maintain hostile silence during his first week in the canyon. "He thinks you've abandoned your own people to take care of your enemy's children." Her insight was accurate. Thomas had made several comments in Apache that he thought Daisy Lou couldn't understand. Comments that questioned Grey Eagle's loyalty and suggested that helping white children was a betrayal of Apache values. Grey Eagle decided to address Thomas's anger directly, using the boy's own cultural knowledge as a bridge to understanding. "You think I have chosen white children over Apache children," he said to Thomas in their shared language. "But you are Apache, and you are here. Miguel is Mexican, part of the people who have been our allies against white expansion. Rebecca is the daughter of Mexican settlers who have always treated Apache people with respect. These are not the children of our enemies. These are children who have been wounded by the same evil that has wounded our people." The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Apache. with Daisy Lou listening without understanding the words, but clearly following the emotional undercurrents of the exchange. Thomas spoke of his months in military custody, of the things that had been done to him, and the way his own people had turned away from him when he returned. Gray Eagle responded with stories of his own losses, his own struggles with anger, and the desire for revenge, and his gradual understanding that healing required choosing love over hatred. "The white soldiers who hurt you were evil," Gray Eagle said finally. "But the white child who sits beside our fire, learning to be strong again, is not your enemy. She is a fellow survivor, a fellow warrior in the battle against those who would break the spirits of children. If you cannot see that difference, then you are still a prisoner of your anger, and your captors have won." The words were harsh, but they were delivered with the kind of tough love that Apache culture understood. Thomas was quiet for several days after that conversation. But Gray Eagle noticed that he stopped making hostile comments about the other children and began observing them with something closer to curiosity than contempt. The breakthrough came when Rebecca had a nightmare and woke the entire camp with her screaming. While Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou tried to comfort the younger child, Thomas appeared beside them and began singing a traditional Apache lullaby, his young voice carrying the ancient melody that spoke of protection and peace. Rebecca didn't understand the words, but she understood the intention behind them, and her crying gradually subsided as Thomas continued his song. When she finally fell back asleep, the Apache boy looked at Gray Eagle with eyes that no longer held quite so much anger. "She's just a baby," he said quietly. "Whoever hurt her, they were cowards. Only cowards hurt babies." It was the beginning of Thomas's transformation from angry victim to protective older brother. As the seasons turned and more children found their way to the canyon, Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou developed a system that combined Apache wisdom with practical necessity. Each child was taught the same basic survival skills, the same self-defense techniques, the same lessons about finding food and water and shelter in the wilderness. But beyond these practical matters, each child was also given something more precious: the understanding that they were not alone in their suffering, and that recovery was not only possible, but inevitable if they were willing to do the work. Daisy Lou had become the heart of their operation, the living example that proved healing was possible. At 8 years old, she possessed emotional wisdom that many adults never developed, and her ability to connect with traumatized children was nothing short of miraculous. She could sit with the most damaged child for hours without speaking, communicating through presence alone that she understood their pain and would not judge them for it. "You have a gift," Gray Eagle told her one evening as they watched their current group of 6 children practicing the combat techniques he had taught them. Not just for healing, but for teaching others how to heal themselves. "This is your medicine, little warrior. This is what the spirits meant for you to do with your life." He felt a deep satisfaction watching Daisy Lou work with the other children, knowing that she had not only survived her own trauma, but was using that survival to help others. The canyon had been modified to accommodate their growing community. Gray Eagle had built additional shelters using traditional Apache techniques combined with materials scavenged from abandoned settlements. There were sleeping areas for children of different ages, a common area where they gathered for meals and lessons, and a special space set aside for the kind of emotional healing work that couldn't be rushed or forced. More importantly, they had established connections with people throughout the territory who could help them in their mission. Father Miguel Santos, the priest who had sent young Miguel to them, had become an unofficial coordinator, identifying children who might benefit from their unique approach to healing. Dr. Sarah Chun, a Chinese-American physician in Tucson, provided medical care and helped them understand the physical effects of trauma on developing minds and bodies. The most significant addition to their network was Judge Henry Morrison, Captain Morrison's older brother, who had presided over Jeremiah Baker's trial and been deeply moved by Daisy Lou's testimony. Judge Morrison had used his influence to create unofficial legal protections for their work, ensuring that the children in their care wouldn't be forcibly removed by well-meaning, but ignorant authorities who didn't understand what they were trying to accomplish. What you're doing here goes against everything I was taught about proper child welfare, Judge Morrison admitted during one of his visits to the canyon. But I can't argue with the results. These children are thriving in ways that conventional orphanages never could have achieved. He watched Thomas teaching Rebecca how to weave a basket, both children focused and peaceful in ways that would have been impossible when they first arrived. As their first year of operation drew to a close, Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou faced a decision that would shape the future of their work. Word of their success had reached territorial officials in Washington, and there was pressure to formalize their operation, to turn it into an official government program with regulations and oversight and all the bureaucratic machinery that such recognition would entail. They want to help us, Daisy Lou said as they discussed the offers that had been made. But they want to help us their way, not our way. They want to turn this into another orphanage with rules and schedules, and people who don't understand what we're really doing here. Her insight was accurate. The government officials meant well, but they couldn't comprehend that healing trauma required approaches that couldn't be reduced to policy manuals. Gray Eagle had been thinking about the same problem. If we accept their help, we gain resources and protection, but we lose the freedom to do what works best for each child. If we refuse their help, we remain free to operate as we choose, but we also remain vulnerable to those who would shut us down because we don't fit their understanding of how such work should be done. It was a dilemma with no perfect solution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas, who had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus he brought to everything he considered important, spoke up with a suggestion that surprised both adults. Why not do both? He asked. Keep this place secret and free, but also help them start official places that can help some children, even if they can't help all children. Not everyone needs what we have here, but everyone deserves some kind of help. Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou looked at each other, recognizing the wisdom in Thomas's words. They could maintain their canyon sanctuary for the children who needed their specialized approach while also working within the system to improve conditions for children in conventional institutions. It would mean more work, more complexity. But it would also mean helping more children. We'll need help, Daisy Lou said practically. We can't run this place and also work with the government programs, and also keep finding new children who need us. We'll need other adults who understand what we're doing and why it matters. She had learned to think strategically about their mission, to see beyond the immediate needs of individual children, to the larger systemic changes that would be required. That night, as they sat around their fire with their current group of children, Gray Eagle felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending kind of completion, but the kind that marked the successful completion of one phase and the beginning of another. Daisy Lou had grown from a victim to a survivor to a healer, and their canyon had become something unique in the territory. A place where the impossible became routine and broken children learned to believe in their own strength again. Tomorrow, we start expanding, Gray Eagle announced to the children gathered around their fire. Not just helping more children, but teaching other adults how to help children the way we've learned to help each other. Each of you will have the chance to become teachers yourselves, to pass on what you've learned here to others who need it. The children listened with the serious attention they had learned to bring to important announcements. Miguel, now fluent in English and confident in ways that would have been unimaginable when he first arrived, raised his hand with a question. Will we always be able to come back here? If we go out to help other children, will this place still be home? His question spoke to the deep human need for a safe base, a place of belonging that couldn't be taken away. This canyon will always be here for any of you who need it, Gray Eagle promised. But more than that, you will carry this place with you wherever you go. The strength you've found here, the healing you've accomplished here, The love you've given and received here, all of that becomes part of who you are. You can create new versions of this place wherever you find children who need what we've learned to give. 5 years had passed since Gray Eagle first found a broken child sitting on the steps of an abandoned trading post. And the transformation of both their lives had rippled outward in ways neither of them could have imagined. Daisy Lou, now 12 years old, stood before the territorial legislature in Phoenix, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the assembled lawmakers about the need for specialized care facilities for traumatized children. "Honorable members of the legislature," Daisy Lou said, her small hands gripping the podium with the same steady determination she had once used to hold her knife. "I stand before you today not as a victim of cruelty, but as proof that healing is possible when children are given the right kind of help. The programs we have developed in partnership with Territorial Social Services have already helped more than 200 children across Arizona find their way back to hope and strength." Gray Eagle watched from the gallery with a pride so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. The silent, terrified child he had rescued had become an articulate advocate for others who suffered as she had suffered. Her testimony had already convinced 3 other territories to adopt modified versions of their healing approach, and her reputation as an expert on childhood trauma had spread as far as Washington, D.C. The legislative session was part of a larger transformation that had begun in their hidden canyon, but now encompassed a network of facilities, trained counselors, and support systems that stretched across the American Southwest. The original canyon remained their headquarters and training center, but it was no longer the only place where damaged children could find the specialized care they needed to recover from severe trauma. After Daisy Lou finished her presentation and answered questions from the lawmakers with poise that would have impressed seasoned politicians, she joined Gray Eagle outside the Capitol building. "How did I do?" she asked, though her confident demeanor suggested she already knew the answer. "You spoke truth with the authority of someone who has lived it," Gray Eagle replied, his voice warm with affection and respect. "Your words will save lives, little warrior. Children who haven't even been born yet will benefit from the seeds you planted in that room today." He had learned to see beyond immediate results to the long-term impact of their work, understanding that true change happened across generations. Their next stop was the Phoenix Home for Special Cases, one of 12 facilities that had been established using the principles they had developed in the canyon. Unlike traditional orphanages that focused on basic care and placement, these homes specialized in helping children recover from severe trauma, sexual abuse, and other forms of systematic cruelty that required more than conventional social services could provide. The director of the Phoenix facility was Maria Santos, Miguel's older sister, who had sought them out 2 years earlier after completing her education at a teacher's college in California. She had wanted to understand what had transformed her angry, damaged little brother into the confident, compassionate young man he had become, and she had stayed to help create similar transformations for other children. "We have 17 children currently in residence," Maria reported as they toured the facility. 3 of them came to us completely nonverbal, just as Daisy Lou was when you first found her. All 3 are now speaking and participating in group activities. The techniques you developed for building trust and confidence have proven remarkably effective across different cultural backgrounds and types of trauma. Gray Eagle nodded as he observed the children in the facility's common areas. These children were learning the same skills he had taught Daisy Lou and the others, the same combination of practical survival techniques and emotional healing work that had proven so successful in the canyon. But they were learning from trained adults who had been taught to recognize and respond to the subtle signs of trauma recovery. The most remarkable aspect of their expanded operation was the role that former canyon children played as mentors and teachers. Thomas, now 17 and fluent in 3 languages, traveled between facilities conducting training sessions for new staff members. Rebecca, despite being only 11, had demonstrated such natural gifts for connecting with traumatized children that she spent her summers helping at different facilities while continuing her own education during the school year. Miguel had chosen a different path, one that took him beyond the direct service work to address the systemic issues that created traumatized children in the first place. At 14, he was working with territorial marshals to identify and prosecute adults who preyed on children, using his own experiences and insights to help law enforcement understand how such predators operated and how their victims could be helped to testify effectively. The work has grown beyond what any of us imagined, Daisy Lou observed as they walked through the Phoenix facility's training gardens, where children learn to grow their own food while developing patience and nurturing skills. Sometimes I look at all these places, all these people helping children heal, and I can barely remember what it felt like to be that scared little girl who couldn't speak. Gray Eagle understood her sentiment. The terrified child and the confident young advocate seemed like different people, connected by memory, but separated by the profound transformation that trauma recovery could accomplish when it was supported properly. You carry her with you. Still, he said gently, she's the source of your wisdom, the reason you understand what other children need. She was not weak or broken. She was surviving the only way she knew how until someone showed her a different way was possible. Their final stop of the day was the most important one, a return to the canyon where everything had begun. The original camp had been expanded with permanent structures, but it retained the intimate feel of a family compound rather than an institutional facility. Currently, it housed 8 children, all of them dealing with particularly severe trauma that required the intensive, individualized attention that only the original facility could provide. Among the current residents was a 5-year-old Navajo girl named Little Star, who had been found living wild in the desert after escaping from a trading post, where she had been kept as essentially a slave. She had been at the canyon for 3 months, and was just beginning to trust the adults around her enough to accept food from their hands. Daisy Lou spent the evening with Little Star, not trying to force interaction, but simply being present. In the patient, understanding way she had learned from Gray Eagle, the 2 children sat together in comfortable silence, Little Star gradually moving closer until she was finally close enough for Daisy Lou to begin braiding flowers into her tangled hair. She reminds me of you, Gray Eagle said quietly as he watched the gentle interaction between the 2 girls. Same age, same look in her eyes, same careful way of testing whether the world might be safe after all. He had learned to see the patterns in childhood trauma, to recognize the signs that indicated whether a child was ready to begin healing or still needed more time to feel secure. She's stronger than I was, Daisy Lou replied with certainty. She survived alone in the desert for weeks. I never could have done that. She just needs to learn that she doesn't have to be alone anymore, that there are people who will protect her without trying to own her. The distinction was important. Many adults who wanted to help traumatized children made the mistake of trying to control them, not understanding that control felt like a threat to children who had been controlled by their abusers. As night fell over the canyon, the current residents gathered around the fire for the evening storytelling session that had become a central ritual of the healing process. Gray Eagle told the same kinds of stories he had told Daisy Lou years earlier, tales of courage and survival and the triumph of good over evil. But now he had new stories to tell as well, stories about the children who had found healing in this place and gone on to help others find the same healing. There was once a little girl who had forgotten how to speak. Gray Eagle began, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. She sat alone in a ruined place, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had once trusted, and she believed that silence was the only safety left in the world. But silence, she learned, was not safety. It was just another kind of prison. The children listened with the focused attention that traumatic experience had taught them to bring to stories about survival. A warrior found her there, a man who had lost his own family and forgotten his own reasons for hope. He was as broken as she was, but broken in different ways. And together, they discovered that sometimes two broken things can help each other become whole again. Gray Eagle's eyes found Daisy Lou across the fire, and she smiled with the deep contentment of someone who had found her true purpose in life. The little girl learned to speak again, but more than that, she learned that her voice had power. She learned that her survival could become a gift to others who were still trapped. In the silence she had escaped. And the warrior learned that protecting others could heal the wounds that revenge had only made deeper. The story continued, weaving together themes of healing, purpose, and the way individual recovery could ripple outward to benefit entire communities. When the storytelling ended and the children had been settled in their sleeping places, Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou sat together under the desert stars, sharing the comfortable silence of people who had been through extraordinary experiences together. The canyon was quiet except for the normal sounds of the desert night, but both of them could feel the presence of all the children who had found healing in this place. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night? Daisy Lou asked, her voice thoughtful rather than sad. If you had just ridden past the trading post and left me sitting there. It was a question that had occurred to both of them over the years, though neither had ever spoken it aloud. Gray Eagle considered the question seriously. I think you would have found another way to survive, he said finally. You had the strength inside you all along. I just helped you remember it was there. But if I hadn't found you, I think I would have died inside completely. You gave me back my reasons for living, little warrior. You saved me as much as I saved you. The mutual rescue had been one of the most profound aspects of their relationship. We saved each other, Daisy Lou agreed. And then we learned how to help other people save themselves. I think that's what real healing looks like. Not just getting better, but getting strong enough to help others get better too. She had learned to see individual recovery as part of a larger process of community healing. As they prepared to end their day, a rider approached the canyon entrance, calling out the recognition signals that identified friendly visitors. It was Dr. Sarah Chun, bringing news from Tucson and another child who might benefit from their specialized approach to trauma recovery. The work never ended, but that was exactly as it should be. As long as there were children who needed healing, there would be people committed to providing it. Another child to help, Gray Eagle observed as they prepared to greet their visitor. Another chance to prove that recovery is possible, that no one is too broken to heal if they are given the right kind of support. He felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing his life had meaning beyond his own survival. Another chance to pass on what we've learned, Daisy Lou added, already thinking about how their newest arrival would fit into the canyon community and what specific approaches might work best for his or her particular needs. Another chance to show someone that they are not alone, that they are not damaged beyond repair, that they have value and strength and the right to be safe and happy. The stars wheeled overhead as they had for countless generations, indifferent to human suffering but somehow blessing the work being done in their light. In a hidden canyon in the Arizona territory, broken children continued to learn that healing was possible, that trauma did not have to define their futures, and that sometimes the most damaged souls could become the most powerful healers. The cycle continued, as it always would, as long as there were people willing to believe in the possibility of redemption and recovery. Gray Eagle and Daisy Lou walked toward their visitor together, ready to begin another rescue, another healing, another demonstration that love could triumph over cruelty when it was backed by wisdom, patience, and the unshakable belief that every child deserved a chance to discover their own strength. The work that had begun with one broken child and one grieving warrior had become something larger than either of them had ever imagined. But at its heart, it remained the same simple truth, that healing was always possible when people chose to care for each other with genuine commitment, understanding.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.